Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Shvis Perek Zayin Halacha Aleph. We're learning today Daf Nun Hey. We left off on Daf Nun Hey, Amid Aleph, Mamish, all the way on top of the Amid. And we just came off a Braisa in which we learned that even though Shemen Shel Shvis Madlikin Boy, even though oil, olive oil, or any other oil could be used for consumption, but since it's common practice to also use oil for kindling a candle, for fuel, one is allowed to do so, even though the shemen is of shvi'is. It's not considered somehow disrespecting or wasting product of shvi'is, which may not be done. It is allowed to be done. Nevertheless, midarabanan, if a person sold the oil of shvi'is, and now we know that not only does the oil itself retain its kedusha, but the money that you received for the oil also is imbued with kedusha shvi'is, and therefore it should not be even more stringent than the source, but it is. Midrabanan, the rule is that machari v'lokech by shemen ein madlikin boy. And as we explained, that chachamim were afraid that if a person would be allowed to use the money to buy oil for fuel, they might forget that the money is imbued with kedusha shvi'is, and then they might use the money not the way one needs to treat anything that has in it the kedusha of shvi'is. In other words, chomer b'damim shel shvi'is yoiser mishvi'is atzman. That was the rule that we learned yesterday. Now, based on that rule, we're going to open up today's daf by speaking about a very great inquiry regarding the above rule, the logic above the above rule, the application of the above rule, certain scenarios that will be very interesting based on the above rule. And we're going to from there go to having a beautiful conversation regarding exchanging human food for animal food. In other words, even though, like we mentioned, shemen shel shvi'is madlikin boy, but there is always this concern that we cannot downgrade the use of shvi'is product, all based on the rule la'achla v'loy lahefsid. I know hefsid literally means to waste it mamish, but even if you're not wasting it in the most conventional sense, any downgrade, which might be something that is designated for human food, if it's going to be used for animal fodder, you can argue you are mafsid human food, and indeed, as we will see, it will not be something that you would be allowed to do. Now, the Gemara today on Daf Nun Hey is also going to discuss a little bit more details about the din of biur, because what we keep on mentioning, which is correct, that when is someone chayiv to do the biur, right, on anything that is, to begin with, subject to biur, because this product is einoi miskayim ba'aretz. So we say, when that item is no longer available in the fields for the chayas, from then you have to do biur. Now, if one knows exactly when that happened on that given year, on that given shvi'is, okay, now that you know, you have to practice biur. Question is, if you don't know, you're living in the city. So we'll see that there are certain presumed times in which we say that for this product in this region in Eretz Yisrael at this given time, the presumption is it's no longer found in the fields, and therefore it's chayiv and shvi'is. We're going to see, we're going to actually quote a Mishnah that we're going to have later regarding oil, regarding wine, regarding dates, regarding figs. And then we're going to bring today's topic, which is what happens if you exchange one with the other, again, all based on the principle that the exchange item is imbued with the kedusha of the original item. And actually, sometimes we even go more and we say that chomer b'damim shel shvi'is yoiser mishvi'is atzman. And we're going to see, it's amazing how this will apply on such an exchange, b'negei dinei biur. The Gemara today will also go back to Halacha Aleph and clarify various other parts of the Mishnah. We're going to get into more details about the rule that ein oisen schayra benevelos v'treifos v'shkatzim v'ramasim. And we're going to have a braisa that will begin today, God willing, and we're going to continue in the next year. That's going to actually have an asmachta. It's a midrabanan halacha. It's midoraisa. You can do business benevelos v'treifos, like we mentioned. It's befedish on the pasuk that you can give it to the ger, you can sell it to the non-Jew. Abed midrabanan, we really limit the type of sales that you may make. You can always sell it, but as we'll define again, the concept of schoira, of buying and reselling, that's something that may not be done, but we're going to have an asmachta, and we'll leave it at that. Chevra daf nun hey amud aleph, all the way on top of the amud. So you have oil of shvi'is that could be used for kindling. The Braisa spoke about you selling that beheter. Again, schoira means buying and reselling. On shvi'is, if I have a small amount, for sure, a limited product, small amount of it, and I'm selling it in order to buy food for me to eat, that for sure is permissible according to all of the Rishonim. It's not included in the issur of doing schoira with Peda shvi'is. So I have a small amount of oil. I want to buy more lekavet Shabbos kugel. I sell my oil. Now I sell it. Now this money, what happens if I want to take this money and buy my Shabbos candles? So here Chazal say you can't do that. Even though the original is allowed to be used for kindling, the rule is that you cannot use the money for kindling. So now comes a Gavaldike inquiry. Says Ravimi, in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, what happens if hechlif shemen b'shemen? This is quite amazing. The din of exchanging and the money going into the kedusha going into the money isn't only by money, but it's also by a barter. So let's go. Chevra, Reuven and Shimon. Reuven has shemen of shvi'is. Shimon has stam oil of the 6th year. Reuven and Shimon exchange oils for whatever reason. Or I'll tell you better. Shimon also has shemen of shvi'is. They both have oil of shvi'is. And for whatever reason, Reuven and Shimon exchange the oil one with the other. Ich weiß, one is olive oil and one is canola oil. Now, each oil, like we mentioned, when you sell a product of shvi'is, the original product does not lose its kedusha shvi'is. So every oil now has really 2 kedushas in it. It has its original kedusha shvi'is, and it is also now an exchange for something else of shvi'is. When you look at the part of it, the side that says it's inherently shvi'is, that allows it to be used for kindling. But each one is also an exchange of shvi'is. The exchange part in the oil does not allow you to use it for kindling. So and that trumps. And therefore, Shneim Asurim, because since each one has a tzad of exchange, that side of exchange does not allow that oil to be used for kindling, even though the oil on itself would be allowed to be used for kindling.
What does the exchange do that causes this? What is the problem with exchanging?
In other words, that's what we spoke out in the intro, Nachamol. We learned in the Taita yesterday. Shemen shal shvi'is madliken boy, but mecharei v'lokach by shemen ein madliken boy.
Okay, sorry.
Very simple. In other words, the exchange, if I sell oil and I get money, the kedusha is in the money. If I take the money and I buy oil, stam oil, now the kedusha goes into that oil. That's the rule. We're gonna learn the words later. Acharon, exchange item also has kedusha shvi'is. So now if you barter oil for oil, both oils will shall shvi'is. And for whatever reason, they exchange it. And now they used it for cooking, and now there's extra oil, and they want to use it for kindling. There's also inherent shvi'is oil, shvi'is shel oil, shemen shel shvi'is and shel shvi'is, but each one is also the exchange of shemen shel shvi'is. Kindling. Now, what do you do if you want to use it for kindling? So, Ketzad Hu'aisa, there's a solution. Daf Nun Hey, Rab Chizki oil, other oil that's not of shvi'is. Machlif shneim shel chulin. Reuven and Shimon, each one should take another job exchange. when it comes to the kedusha of the exchange, it always goes into the last item that it was exchanged for. Indeed, this last one, shel chulin, will not be allowed to be used for kindling. So make sure you exchange it on a shemen shel chulin that you will dafka use for food. But what are you benefiting? Now this one will always retain its inherent kedusha of shvius. That never goes away. But that add-on of now this is also an exchange for shemen shel shvius, and that is what this allows you to use it for kindling. That left it because you exchange it on another oil. All of this is based on the rule, and this is it's called achrin nispas. The rule is a product. You have an apple. The apple has kedusha shvius. If you sold the apple for money, the apple retains kedusha shvius, and so does the money. If this money now bought dates, the money now went out l'chulin. The dates have kedusha shvius. If you exchange the dates for meat, the dates are chulin. The meat has kedusha shvius. In other words, by shvius, the original always retains the kedusha, and the exchanged item has exchanged kedusha, but that keeps on moving. And it always lands only on the last one. So if you take this exchange oil and you exchange it again for a chulin oil, so now the chulin oil has the exchanged kedusha. The chulin oil will be bound by the rule that ein madlikin boy. But the one that you use to make that exchange, which is also inherent shvius, will have kedusha shvius because it was a product of shvius. It came from olives that grew on shvius, but shemen shel shvius madlikin boy. Continues the Gemara.
Sorry, I'm a little lost in this. So the first item has kedusha shvius. We get that. You sell it for money. The money acquires kedusha shvius. Then you take the money, you buy another shemen. Now that has kedusha shvius, but the money doesn't.
Exactly.
And then you take the second kedusha shvius, the second shemen.
You sell it again.
You barter it again or sell it again, then either the money or the bartered item acquires kedusha shvius, but the
middle one,
item you traded loses the kedusha shvius.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, Vlad, by shvius, the original product always remains holy, and the last exchanged item for it remains holy. The in-betweens don't.
What's the purpose of that? I'm trying to get the logic in that, and I'm not sure of the logic.
So let me make a contrast before we get to the logic. What's unique about shvius is that let's speak about Meiser Sheni. If you have product that's mamish Meiser Sheni, Vlad, when you exchange it for money, that product itself, the original product of Meiser Sheni, is no longer Meiser Sheni. Only the money is Meiser Sheni. Or by Hegdish, if I have something, I said, I'm giving whatever, my item to the Beis HaMikdash. Guy donates his car to the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash doesn't need the car, but they're going to sell it. So before them selling it, the car is holy. When they sell it, the car is chulin. The money is holy. By shvius, the rule is that when you exchange shvius for money or for an item, the original is holy and the exchange is holy.
Is this the only thing?
But we limit that, like you said, Vlad. We don't say that the exchange is holy, and then the next exchange, you have 3 items holy, and if you make another exchange, you have 4 items holy. That we don't say already. The original and the last one.
Or is this the only item that when it's exchanged, the original item retains its kedusha?
This is the only item that the original always retains kedusha, as does the last. Okay. Says the Gemara, let's go on the same logic now. If a person exchange, guys, yayin, we're speaking about shvi'is wine for oil. Guys, the oil is non-shvi'is oil. I want to make that clear. So now, when it comes to wine, since the common use of wine is for drinking, most people do not use wine to smear their bodies with it. Most people do not use wine for fuel. I don't even know how it could be fuel, but they don't use it for that. And therefore, wine, because of its kedusha, and kedusha shvius carries with it the rule, you may not destroy it. Therefore, wine, if someone wants to use wine to massage their feet with, on yayin shel shvius, they may not do it. If you exchange wine for oil, the oil acquires the same limitations as its source. Or the kavase now shemen ein sachanoisai, nor can you use the shemen for kindling. So that's another a beautiful way of looking at this. If the oil itself would have been shemen shel shvi'is, imagine if the oil came from olives that grew on shvi'is, based on the rule we learned yesterday in the Braisa that shemen shel shvi'is, yes, can be used for kindling, I would be allowed to use the oil for kindling. But if I begin with shemen of chulin, shemen of the 5th year, but I have wine of shvi'is, if I bartered the yayin on the oil, now that the yayin remains holy and the oil is holy, the oil doesn't follow the rules of oil. The oil has to follow the rules of the wine. The oil can only be used for consumption, and it cannot be used for sicha, which oil normally could. Oil cannot be used for kindling, even though oil itself could. Another place where you see that the exchange will be more stringent than the original in a different way, because the original is wine. Here it is stringent like the original, but the original is wine. So we're taking the chumras of wine and we're putting it on the oil.
So if we were to now take this oil and exchange it again,
very good.
Now the oil would go back to being oil.
Now the oil will go to be chulin oil. Exactly. Mamish. Very good. Very good. Okay, now we're gonna move to biur. Same idea. So when we are saying that the exchanged product is bound by the rules of the original product. Until now we were speaking about, well, can you use it for kindling or not? Can you use it to smearing or not? Now let's go to items that are subject to the din of biur versus other products of shvius that are not subject to biur. One is not miskayim ba'aretz, subject to biur. One is miskayim ba'aretz. So what happens, as an example, if a person exchanges olin shvi'is leaves for shvi'is shoots? We're speaking about types of shoots that do not wither in winter. The shoots would not have been subject for biur. The leaves are subject to biur. So you made an exchange of the leaves. And then I had leaves. The leaves had to be biured by the time of biur. And I got an exchange, a lulav, kamod the tamer olin yesh lahem biur, since it began with an item that's subject to biur. So now again, the exchange item also are bound to biur, which is mamish gavaldik, even though they inherently would not have been subject to biur, because the exchange item acquires all of the stringencies of the original item, and again, really, sometimes even more midrabanan. Another case, hechlev oichli adam ba'oichle behema. Now, the Gemara in a moment is going to challenge the permissibility of this. Before we get to that challenge, if you have food that is human food, designated for human food, commonly used for human food, you have animal fodder, and you made an exchange. So let's go to another din that's unique. That kamad the tamer oichle adam ein oisin mehem elugma. Guys, we're going to learn this explicitly on our pagination on Daf Samach. But it's going to be in Perek Ches Halacha Aleph, even though we already mentioned this, I think it was yesterday, regarding they used to use certain food items, certain plants, as bandages for wounds, plasters for wound, called them a lugma. And even though we learned that you could do it, what we were learning yesterday or 2 days ago was only if the original food was designated for animal food. Animal food being used for a human bandage is not called ruining it. Actually, it's called upgrading it, because it went from being is an item that will service animals to something that will service a human being. But if you have oichlei adam, even though you're putting on the plaster on an adam, but it's called a downgrade. And therefore it's called you are ruining it, you're destroying it. Because if originally it would have been used for consumption, for achila, only using it for a plaster, which by the way, when you turn it into a plaster, you make it inedible, is something that you're not allowed to do. So oichle yodam has that limitation. Oichle behema is allowed to be made into a plaster, into a bandage for a human being. But if you had oichle adam and you exchange it for oichle behema, so here again, the oichle behema acquires the stringency of its source. Udekavase, now that you made the exchange, oichle behema ein oisen behema lugma. Beautiful. So these are 3 examples of what happens when you make an exchange. The kedusha only goes up. The stringencies only grow. Nothing becomes alleviated. Nothing becomes more lenient. Now the Gemara is going to question the mitzias of the 3rd case. How is that even allowed? The Gemara, how can you tell me? How can you give me a case? As it's a beautiful example, but that example of chayda should be usher. That what? That you're exchanging erchli adam oichle behema v'hatanina. We learned this is quoting a baraisa. Moichlin oichle adam oichle behema likach behem oichle adam. That on the Shemitah year, in the limited way that does not go against the rule of doing merchandising with Pei Shvi'is, I collected some food items for me, or I collected animal fodder for me to use with my animals, and in a certain, for sure, small amount, I am allowed to sell it. The money, however, acquires Kedusha Shvi'is Vlad, right? Because it was exchanged for a Shvi'is product. Shvi'is products are not allowed to be used for anything. You cannot waste it. That goes into the money. Using that to buy human food is not called wasting it. Actually, if you exchanged oichle behema for money, then for oichle adam, you upgraded it. That direction is permitted. Avol loy oichle behema likach behem oichle behema. Imagine you can't even sell animal foods to buy other animal foods. You would ask, why not? Why not? You're not downgrading it. The answer is because since there is a prohibition of doing merchandising, of doing schayre b'pei shvius, so the chachamim, by oichli adam, we said, it doesn't apply to a limited sale. By behema, they did limit it. Midrabanan, they says, oichle behema cannot be exchanged at all. Eat it or don't eat it. But don't sell it and buy stuff with it. So that's a rabbinic prohibition. And V'kol Shchein says the Braisa, one is not allowed to sell oichle adam to buy oichle behema. So therefore, how can you give me as a 3rd example that if someone was machlev oichle adam oichle behema, so now the rule of ein oisen melugma ma oichle adam goes into the oichle behema? How did that mitzias happen to begin with? Asks the Gemara. Answers the Gemara, I'll give you an example. I'll give you a case where such an exchange will be allowed. Exchanging oichle adam or oichle behema. What would that be? Bahadam kinifta de yarka. If you have leaves that are trimmed from greens, we all know that if you look at greens, when they begin to wither from the periphery. Even by lettuce, we're familiar with. The outermost part begins to turn brown. And what many people do is that they trim off the brown to leave the fresh. Before it turned brown, it was oichle adam. What do people do with that trimmed edges of the vegetables? It used to be oichle adam. They no longer can eat it. Now it's no longer edible. So the din is so the rule is that what do you do with it? Maskan lalik, bring it up to your roof. The hiyavshim min gama, it's going to completely dry out. What happens when they completely dry out? It's amazing. Even before they completely dried out, even animals won't eat it. It won't smell good. It's going to smell like rotten. But when it dries out, it becomes animal food. Okay. So the point is, these leaves, listen to the chumrah, these leaves are allowed to be exchanged for animal food because they're no longer oichle adam. Now, even though these leaves are now going to become oichle behema, since they started out as oichle adam, they always retain the chumrah that you may never use them to make this melugma. You may maybe it's impossible to do so, but the rule remains. And in this, if someone exchanged now these leaves for oichle behema, even though oichle behema is not allowed to be used to make a melugma. And we resolve the mitziastic question, you can't exchange oichle adam to begin with. There are certain scenarios when something becomes naturally inedible, you are allowed to make that, you are allowed to turn it into oichle behema, and therefore you are allowed to exchange it for oichle behema. Okay, that answered that question. Turning to Daf Nun Hey Yomid Beis. Rabbi Yochanan, b'shem Rabbi Shimon ben Yohid Tzadok. Here it's without the hey. I know in the Bible it's Yohid Tzadok. Here it's Yohid Tzadok. And quickly, again, mentioning the laws of biur. If I have wheat and I know my neighborhood, my region in the Holy Land, and I know that this wheat is still available in the fields for animals. If I know that, I don't have to do biur yet. If I have wine, and by the way, just for the record, the biur of wine will not be in the 7th year. It's amazing. Because the biur of certain items only go into effect on the 8th year. Because many items that grow in the Holy Land, they become ripe, let's say Shavuos time, like Chag HaBikurim. When do they wither? When do they wither in the field? Winter. Winter is already in the 8th year. Doesn't bother me. And if I have items that are products of the 7th year, just to quickly repeat, how you classify what year it belongs to, it has to do with what is the Rosh Hashanah, Echad B'Tishrei, Tu B'Shvat, and it has to do with Hashrasha, it has to do with Shlish, it has to do with Chanata, it has to do with Likita. So once this is of the 7th year, the obligation of biur, when there is an obligation of biur, won't always happen on the 7th year. Wine and oil will be great examples. Wine and oil of product of the 7th year, oil of Shvi'is, wine of Shvi'is, are both subject to biur, but biur will only take place in the 8th year. Now, when in the 8th year, that if you know, you know. The statement of Rabbi Yochanan now is if you don't know what's happening, let's say you like nowadays, we live in the city, we really don't know what's going on out there in the fields. So there is a presumed halachic time where now this is no longer available. And when will that be? Bayayin at ha-Pesach. It's amazing. That means that Pesach of the 8th year is the time that let's go according to the Ramban, you have to take all of your wine of the 7th year. You have to take it out of your house. You have to declare it hefker. According to the Rambam, it's even more than that. Give it to all your chavedim, because basically that's what biur would force one to do. Rambam. The Rambam says that once the time of biur comes, the most you can keep of it is food for 3 meals, and the rest you have to destroy. People don't like destroying food, so what would they do? They would give it to their friends. They would make a big gathering. They would make a big fabrengen. However biur is done. So the presumed time of doing biur, biyayin, is Pesach of the 8th year. B'shemen, the presumed time when the olives of the 7th year, listen to this, is no longer in the fields, that's Shavuos of the 8th year. And therefore you have to do biur on the shemen of Shvi'is. Big Greigarois, if you have figs, now figs, bachlal, anything that's moist doesn't last at all. So we're speaking about what was commonly done. They dried out the figs. When does the time of biur, when is the presumed time of biur of figs? Purim, all of the 8th year. And now we have another shear, Rabbi, Chanina, I'll give you a 4th. That betmarim, when it comes to dates, at Chanukah. That's the presumed time. Why are we mentioning all this? Why are we mentioning all this? Because now that we established that when you exchange one thing for the other, that's the whole vart. The exchanged item is subject to the stringencies of the original item, and the Gemara just applied this to biur in the case of the leaves and the lulav. Now the Gemara is really saying you have to apply the same things to the time of biur. Amazing.
Even though the second item had a different biur on
Even
its
the
own.
second item in itself would have been permissible. Biur would only be in a couple of weeks from now. But if it came from, that's the whole vart of the Gemara. Okay. Now the Mishnah gave examples of products, of fruits, by saying that they have kedusha shvi'is, and if you sold them, you bartered them, uledemeim shvi'is. What the Mishnah did not mention when it gave the examples of sub-products of fruits, the Mishnah never spoke about biur. And the Gemara is wondering, did the Mishnah not speak about it because if something comes from a tree, they're never subject to beer, or the Mishnah didn't find it necessary? So when the Mishnah says kliper imain, v'haneit shaloi, the rind of the pomegranates, the blossom of the pomegranates, the Mishnah spoke about the klipa of walnuts, pits, that yesh lahem shviyis, ulodameim shviyis. What about beer? So Rabbi Ila b'shem Rab Shimon ben Va says, shared, that Rabbi Yochanan v'chavrusei, Rabbi Yochanan and his chevre, have a yosanu makshin, they were sitting and learning, and they were asking each other, and they asked, the Mishnah in the Reisha, up until now, and many examples the Mishnah gave, the Mishnah spoke both about shvi'is and about beer. Here, products of a fruit, the Mishnah never spoke about beer. So they wondered, yesh lahem beer or ein lahem beer? They don't know. While they're asking each other these questions, Ava Rabbi Yanai, according to many, Rabbi Yanai was one of the teachers of Rabbi Yochanan, and Amrin, and they said to each other, oh, Gavaldik, we don't know the answer. Hagavra, here comes a man. And therefore, Mishaline, we're going to ask him. So as Rabbi Yanai came to them, also Sha'alune, they indeed asked them, how are we to understand the omission of Rabbeinu HaKadosh? So Amar Lohem, Rabbi Yanai told all of them, he told Rabbi Yochanan, he told his Chaverim, a rule, there's no exception. Kol davar shedarkoi lishoy. Any item that naturally will fall off the tree, when things fall off their tree, they will wither. So yesh lo bir. V'she'ein darkoi lishoy, ein lo bir. A period. Now, when it comes, Lisha means falling off the tree, naturally falling off the tree, which is the first step that needs to happen before something withers away. When you're connected, you don't wither. When we're connected, we daven with the minyan 3 times a day, we learn Torah, we stay connected. You disconnect, you wither. So, now, Rabbi Yanai understood where they're coming from. That was the Chachma of Rabbi Yanai. In other words, they were wondering, why didn't Rabbi mention a rule by Klipe Rima in Vahanetz? The answer is because it's not consistent. Because some trees, that species type of pomegranate, the rind falls off the tree. Others don't. So Rabbi didn't mention it. No, you know the rule. Now that you know the rule, certain items, the leaves of the loof will wither. The ikir, the bulb of the loof won't always. Some items, it varies. Ve'elu, that's what Rabbi Yanai told him. Mehem shedarkam lishor, umehem she'ein darkam lishor. And therefore, since it varies on its subspecies, ushira tanyana mina, he avoided discussing it because it's not consistent. But don't be worried. The rule of biur applies. Now, does this pomegranate, is any part of it subject to biur? Fine. You got to know each case by case. Beautiful answer. Now, at Sabbat Seveya, the Mishnah continued that now that we established that even though la'achla v'lo lehefseid, using an item for dyeing, right? The Gemara had 2 sources, and it ultimately came back to the first one. Lochem la'achla, lochem is inclusive. So yes, I'm allowed to dye. Aber, says the Mishnah, I am not allowed to die for others. I am not allowed to die for others. Because if I get payment for it, Kevan, that's called doing schayra b'peida shvi'is. Now the Mishnah mentioned I'm not allowed to get paid for doing it for others. Question is, am I allowed to do it for others without payment? That's the kasha.
What about a thank you that we talked about before?
Exactly. For myself, I could do it. To do it as a business on Shvi'is, it's not about on Shvi'is, using product of Shvi'is, that's usher. What the Mishnah did not clarify, so therefore the Gemara asks, can I do it for others? I'm a professional dyer. I'm doing it for others. I am not going to get payment, but we all know when I do a favor for you, right, there's some sort of hana'a, toivas hana'a that I can count on. It's going to probably be reciprocated. I think the word probably is a good word. It's not a business transaction, but the knowledge that it's going to probably be reciprocated is some sort of benefit. Can I make that benefit? We don't know. So says the Gemara, the answer is, Miman de Tani, quoting a Braisa, from that which the Braisa says. regarding shal shushis, regarding chalbitzin, regarding these items that I have no idea what they are. Even though chalbitzim, the Gemara said before, it's some sort of egg-like tuber. That's the milky blossom. That's when Kevin was not here, and I mentioned that I looked it up on Google. So you can look up a milky blossom. So that's and the shal shushis is, I don't know. So that says the Braisa, by the way, these are items from which you make dye. That's the ikr. These are items, products that grow in the ground from which you make dyes, D-Y-Es. So hatager oisel atzmai, he can only make it for himself. So says the Gemara, inferring from the words of the Braisa that the only thing that you are allowed to do is for yourself. That means you can't even do for the other, even without charging. Because toivas hana is considered some sort of benefit, and that will be included in the isur, in the prohibition of doing schayra, the peda shvi is. And as we learned in the Mishnah, so now what we spoke about isurim of doing business are certain items that may not be merchandised midrabanan. The big item from the others that the Mishnah mentioned is nevelois utreifos, and shkatzim v'remasim may not be merchandised, may not be bought and sold. And we said dafka merchandise. Merchandise means buying and selling all non-kosher foods. That's very important. So if I already have non-kosher food, and again, this is the big taz. Remember the big klal. The big klal is a klal gadol, that the Chachamim can never prohibit something that the Torah explicitly says is allowed. Can't do that. Torah says explicitly, when we speak about the prohibition of eating nevela, the Torah says, sell it to a goy. So there is a certain limited type of sale that will always remain permitted. Doing schayra doesn't mean selling it. Doing schayra means buying and selling it. So the Mishnah gave an example. Let's say I'm a trapper. I'm a professional trapper. I'm looking to do business with kosher animals. But when you open up a net out there in the forest, who goes into the net? Whoever goes into the net. So since he finds in his net a non-kosher animal, even that is allowed to be sold.
Wow.
And for sure, even a chazer. Because I'm not doing business in selling chazerim. I'm a trapper. And for sure, we said, if I own animals, a farmer has animals, kosher, by the way, a kosher animal that dies is an avela.
Right.
It makes no difference. A chazer, a cow, if they die, they could sell it. When people have a shlachtos and the shechita didn't turn out okay, and therefore that's called a treifa, you could sell it. Just to explain, the isur of doing schayra means I'm not allowed to make a business of buying non-kosher in order to resell it for a profit. I have a business of selling kosher food, and I happen, because of the type of business, like shechita, some animals will become treifa. What do you do with those animals? I know in many slaughterhouses, it's a non-problem because you don't even own the animals. Many slaughterhouses have a kosher line, a non-kosher line. If the shechita wasn't good, it goes to the non-kosher line. It's not owned by Yidden. But let's say Agri. Agri was a kosher shlachtos. And they're dealing with only the kosher types of animals. The animals that become treif, you sell. Not to lose money.
What if it's continuous? It becomes over and over, then it is like a business.
No. Every person who does business, the great Rabashkin, of course, there's a percent of animals that are treif. You will always be selling those animals. That's also allowed. What's not allowed, in other words, I just want to, just like we have in Peder Shvius, you can't do schayda with Peder Shvius, and we keep on learning today about you're selling the oil for wine. How can you do that? You could do that. People, when they hear, and you can't do schayda, doesn't mean you can't make any business transaction. You can't merchandise it. You can't merchandise specifically today for food. Now, by the way, this can go to a supermarket. That's called merchandising. Like certain supermarkets, like over here, they sell. Not only they sell they sell water, they sell soda. They also sell tray for food. You cannot own that supermarket. You are not allowed to own it because you're buying it. Because part of the business is to buy and sell tray for food. You're buying and selling. Right, and Agri doesn't buy tray for meat; it buys living animals.
What if you own a percentage of stocks in a supermarket?
I think that's allowed. The question is if you own a so much stock that you have the
decision making process, right?
I think that l'chayr is awesome. I know Fruma Yidden here in Los Angeles that had opportunities to buy Ralph's or big chains, and they didn't do it. They're not allowed to do it. Okay. Now, what's amazing is that even though it's an Isur Midrabanan, and therefore, obviously, what we're learning now is called an Asmachta. An Asmachta means that even after the Chachamim make a Gzeira, they many times look to find a remez in the Torah. But it's a hint. It's a rabbinic law that they're leaning on a word. So here we have an Asmachta. And what we basically have is that we're going to have psukim in Parsha Shemini. And if you want to see the entire pasuk, if you have in your Gemara the Torah Oyer Hashalim, so we're going to go. It says in Parsha Shemini, "V'negein nevelos." It says, "V'hanoise es nivlasam, yechabes bigadov, v'tomei ada arev." You know, it's when the Torah is speaking about tumas nevela, the pasuk concludes that's Vayikra Yud Aleph pasuk Chav Ches Temeim Heima Lochem. Even though that same pasuk already said that if you even only carry it, you and your garments are tamei v'tamei ad arev, because they have an av, you become a rishon, you have to go to the mikveh, you have to have erev shemesh, beautiful. But the Torah adds temeim heima lachem. That's Yud Aleph Chav Ches. A few psukim later, when we're speaking about tumas shiratzim, so the Torah says v'chol asher yipol min avlasam olav yitma. Tanur, I'm sorry, no, yeah, tanur v'keraim yutatz, because we know. When it comes to tuma, certain articles can be toiveled in the mikvah, and klei chedes, right, earthenware, once they become tamei, shivirasan zeo takanasan, you can't toivel them, and therefore the Torah says yutats, you have to break them. Now, by the way, if you break them halachically enough, and then you remake them, that will be okay. And then again, the Torah concludes temeim heim utemeim yolachem. What are all these words adding? So let's read it inside. When it says Temeim Heima Lochem, that's from Pasuk Chav Ches. The Torah already says not only that it's Metama you and Metama your begadim. Okay, they are Tamei. And then a few psukim later in Pasuk Lamed Aleph, Vaited Utemeim Yu Lochem. So there has to be, the repetition has to be including another prohibition. And this L'chur is an asmachta. So Echad Isur Achila, even though the Torah is speaking about Tuma, the superfluous words are coming to be merames. First of all, aside of the dinim of tuma, you can't eat it, and also ve'echad isur. And we're going to go with the girsa of the gra. If you look in the bottom, the ksav yad aleph in the bottom, ve'echad isur schayra. That will be the source of the Torah repeating the words tameim to tell you that you cannot merchandise with non-kosher foods. And now comes the Gemara. We're going to learn the first line of Daf Nun Vav. The Gemara is going to come with the Gavaldik Chiddush. And that is that kol davar she'isur dvar Torah. When do we apply this rabbinic prohibition of doing schayra b'nevelos v'trefish katzim v'ramasim? Only, guys, remember this, only on an item that is asur mida oiraisa. However, v'chol davar she'isur midivreim, any item that's only asur midrabanan, like Chalav Stam, that's Asur Midrabanan, that's something that you could do business with. So the markets can sell Chalav Stam. Mutter lasis by Schayra. That's the example he's giving. Look inside.
Wait, what if you sell shratzim for fish bait? It's not to eat.
Okay, I don't know, but I'm going to make a guess, a semi-educated guess, that would be permitted. Would be permitted. Now look inside the top Rashirilio, right, the right column. A kol davar she'isur is only midivrein kegoin chalav shechalav egoy. Gives an example. Or murias, or gevina, or vechiltis, v'chol hanumili, that we learned to Masechtas Avodah Zarah over the time. The Chachamim made many yisurim. By the way, the shemen, right, they were aser, and then they were mated it. Right, the same thing with pas. But we have many rabbinic foods that are prohibited. Right? Bishulakum. So all of these things, says the Gemara, the whole davar she'isur midivreim muter lasis by schayra. We're going to stop over here. This is Gavaldik. So that was a big ending over here. We're going to repeat this rule.